This photo is excruciating to see, but it's important that we don't ignore it. I've seen it 1,000 times, and it only becomes more powerful the more I learn about it. In an era when AIDS patients were dehumanized, in this image we're faced with so much humanity it's almost overwhelming. This photo is often credited as a turning point in public perception of the AIDS virus. There's so much pain and sorrow on the surface of this photo, but the deeper you go with this story, the more you learn the capacity of love we're capable of as humans. Let's start with what you see. 32-year-old David Kirby in the final moments of his life, cradled by his father, Bill Kirby, while David's sister and niece look on. There's nothing subtle about this image. You know right away what's happening, and the emotions of the moment are palpable. Looking at this more deeply, we see that David looks like Jesus Christ. The Catholic imagery on the wall behind him feels like God bringing him to the other side. This image is connecting the worlds of the living and the beyond. And that's really where the story of this image itself ends. But if we stop here, we wouldn't know just how deep the story goes and the depths of the beautiful people in this story. Because there are 3 people in this room we haven't discussed yet. First is the photographer, Therese Frare. Second is David's mother, Kay Kirby. And the third is actually present in this photo, although you might not have noticed them yet. David's caregiver, Peta, whose hand we see coming in from the left side of the image. Their lives tie together in a beautiful and tragic way, and their stories are just as important as this one image. Therese Frare was a graduate student at Ohio University when this photo was taken in April 1990. She's often portrayed in stories about this image as a young and inexperienced photographer, but according to Frare, she had been working at newspapers for 12 years before enrolling in grad school. She was already an experienced storyteller. When she enrolled at Ohio University, she knew that covering the AIDS crisis was one of her top priorities. But as she looked for access to patients, she was turned down again and again. Finally, a hospice in Columbus, Ohio, called Paternoster House, told her she was welcome to come in to volunteer. She thought that this was a good place to start and began helping at Paternoster, no camera in hand. After a few months there, the founder, Barb Cordell, decided to open up to the media and invited Frare to begin taking photos. The primary subject of her photography was a young HIV-positive caretaker whose birth name was Patrick Church, but was known to all as Peta. Peta lived with many identities, half white, half native, born male but often female presenting. If Peta lived in current times, they might identify as non-binary according to the people that knew them best. Peta was David Kirby's primary caretaker in his time at Paternoster House. Although Frare's most famous photo is of Kirby, she only spoke with him briefly a few times. In their first interaction, Frare asked Kirby for his permission to photograph him, and he said yes, as long as it's not for personal gain. And Frare, true to her word, has never accepted any money for her photos of Kirby. At age 18, David Kirby left his small town of under 100 residents and became estranged from his family. He moved to California and was a gay activist when he learned in the late 1980s that he had contracted HIV. After receiving his diagnosis, he called his family and they immediately invited him home to Stafford, Ohio, so they could care for him. When David was a patient in the local community hospital, he was treated extremely poorly. According to Kay Kirby, the EMTs burned all the contents of the ambulance after transporting David to the hospital. The person who handed out menus refused to let David hold one for fear of infection, and she would read the meals to him from the doorway. And local children even talked of a, quote, AIDS monster coming to town. So his parents knew they needed to look for other options. And that's when they found Paternoster House in Columbus, which was about 2 hours away from them. Here's Frare's account of the day the photo was taken. She said, "I was visiting Peta because he was David's caregiver. I actually spent the night there, and it was a Sunday, I think. And they came in and said that David was dying. So Peta was called into the place where David was, and it was like a little apartment. And I was sitting in the living room wondering, oh my gosh, what do I do? I really wanted to be there, but, you know. And then David's mother came out to me and said, 'We want you to get people saying their final goodbyes to David.' And I thought, wow, what a gift, because I was struggling with how to best handle the situation. So I went in and just stood there in the corner of the room, trying not to move. I ended up taking around 10 frames. The funny thing is the photo itself was pretty simple, really, but getting in the room took a long time. After the photo was published in Life magazine in November 1990, the image immediately received international attention and accolades. It went on to be colorized and published as an ad by Benetton, sparking controversy within both the LGBTQ and conservative communities. Benetton claimed that the ad was to bring awareness and humanize the AIDS crisis, but many felt they were capitalizing on the suffering of victims. But the ad was created with the permission of both Frare and the Kirby family. Bill and Kay said that any way they could let the world know about their son and the AIDS crisis was worth the backlash. Frare expressed some regret to the Kirbys during these tumultuous times about choosing to let Benetton use the photo, but Bill said to her, quote, "Benetton didn't use us or exploit us. We used them. Because of them, your photo was seen all over the world, and that's exactly what David wanted." Of the ad, Barb Cordell of Paternoster House said, quote, "The picture has done more to soften people's hearts on the AIDS issue than any other I have seen. You can't look at that picture and hate a person with AIDS. You just can't." After David's passing and through all the frenzy around her photo, Frare continued to document Peta. In 1991, she traveled with him to Pine Ridge, a Lakota reservation in South Dakota where he grew up. These images are so beautiful and haunting and filled with spirit. They inspire joy and sadness and capture Peta's depth. These photos feel ethereal and eternal, and we should all see them. In early 1992, as Peta's HIV became AIDS, he returned to Paternoster House to be taken care of by the Kirbys. Upon their son's passing, Bill and Kay committed to taking care of Peta. Kay said, quote, "I made up my mind when David was dying and Peta was helping to care for him, that when Peta's time came, and we all knew it would come, that we would care for him. There was never any question. We were going to take care of Peta. That was that. I took care of Peta as often as I could. It was hard because we couldn't afford to be there all the time, but Bill would come in on the weekends, and we did the best that we could in the short time we had." Kay said that Peta was, quote, "a very difficult patient. He was very clear and vocal about what he wanted and when he wanted it. But during all the time we cared for him, I can only recall once when he yelled at me, and I yelled right back at him, and he knew I was not going to let him get away with that sort of behavior, and we went on from there." Peta passed in the fall of 1992. Frare went on to work for other newspapers and magazines and eventually stopped working as a professional photographer, but she still gives talks about her experience from that time. This story and entire series of photos speaks to the importance and power of photojournalism. Spending time with subjects and building trust can lead to deep and meaningful photography that can change the course of history. Our world is a richer place with these images. In spite of the pain and sorrow they depict, they show the depth of the human spirit, and ultimately it's uplifting to see our capacity for love and unity.